Hi, so today we have with us Suraj Milind Yengde, who's written a global story, Cast a Global Story. Okay, so hi, Suraj.
Hi, Manjula. How are you?
I'm fine. Just so Suraj, this book is it's in depth and it's insightful and it's informative, you know. So maybe we should start with a simple question, like when did you start working on this, and what led you to write this book, which is actually a very big question. So we'll start with that.
Thank you so much, Manjula. First, I should mention that this is my first ever book media interview ever.
Oh,
Um, and you are the first because you are my
thank
editor,
you.
Sahiba. I yeah, I keep I this is my kind of a favorite destination to park much of my ideas and reviews when it comes to book form. So thank you so much, and it was only loyal of me to reciprocate.
Arey yaar.
And you had actually you were among the very first when the book was fresh off the press. You had reached out during summer, and
Yeah,
things took its own time, and I was not really ready to do interviews. Things happen to life. Life happens to things, and
yeah,
and so I kind of jammed all the other interviews. So like first I need to speak to Manjula, and so here we are. Thank
correct.
you one more
Wow,
time.
thank you.
Uh, to the book, Manjula, see, I was not really intending to, I mean, I did not step out to write a book. Like if you would have asked me, because 2011 was when I had, come to the UK. And incidentally, I am right now in London. Uh,
Okay.
and I'd come as a, student from Nanded's kind of a Ambedkar Nagar area. So, and there was like a huge leap, and it doesn't help you if you are traveling, you know, directly from one location to another. There was no sort of initiation, so I was not really
Hmm.
sure what I was to expect in a country. And I
Hmm.
later I realized that there are many of these consultancies and universities that prepare you before you come.
Hmm.
And also, it's obviously if you're going to any foreign country, if you go as a cultural tourist, or if you go as a person from XYZ location, you are initiated. So I was not. So when I kind of came to America, excuse me, to the UK, I was a student, but something that remained in me was this kind of anti-caste Ambedkarite activism. Growing up in a sort of a secular but Buddhist family,
Hmm.
ritually. Uh, and so when I had come here, I was already seeking out for people from my kind of background. It's very interesting. And
Hmm.
so it happened that there was a very vibrant and a very dynamic community that we read about, whose
Yes.
history we read about in this book. But
Hmm.
I had not known then. So I had come in I think in on February 1st, and I remember when the cab dropped me off at the in my university in Birmingham, and as it left, I literally in my mind I was chasing the cab because I was like, what do I do in this? It was gray and it was nothing was there, and I ended up knocking a door, and somebody opened, who was an Italian roommate, and he's like, okay, this is your room. So so my life as a student, and then as someone who grew up as a student activist and leader in Nanded, then going to London, and then eventually going to many other parts of the world, and kind of entering the pockets. When I went first to US in 2015, and I kind of continued that kind of activism in South Africa, where I spent my graduate days. uh,
Hmm.
I did not have that community, right? Because and so as soon as I went to the US, there was a community, and so I interacted with them. They would organize different kind of events. They would organize different kinds of leisure activities, and so I was like, okay, hold on, amazing community meeting over a few days. There's something here, but I was not yet sure what to do. So I was part of an archive that was being created, and so I was collecting almost the stones as you walk through your hike, never knowing the
Hmm.
value of that. And
Mm.
eventually, um, when the time came um, in 2019, I started to kind of think about it more concretely. I was like, hey, listen. Oh, and also this happened. Mr. Lakshmi Berwa, Dr. Lakshmi Berwa, who is
Mm.
this
Mm.
amazing Ambedkarite activist from the 70s, an oncologist, a retired American Air Force um, veteran. He
Mm.
is an Ambedkarite, and he is very conscious because he goes to AIMS at the
Mm.
time, where going to AIMS even now is kind of reputational. So he went there, and so he sent me his boxes of archives. It was in
Oh.
20, I would say 16 or
Okay.
17, 16, 17. He sent me, and so there was a knock from UPS, and they say, you have few boxes, and I'm like, hold on, hey, I was living in an attic room, and student, and poor life, and then when I opened the boxes, it was Lakshmi Beru, and there were so many kind of his life's work. He just wanted to give me away, and at first I thought, why would he give it to me? I had not known him much, but I knew of his work through other scholars. Like for
Mm.
example, Anu Rao had kind of mentioned about his work in one of her talk at Columbia that I was also at. But
Mm.
and also Lakshmi Berwa was kind of a known name, but almost on the margins of archives. You know what I mean? Of those
Mm.
memories. So when
Yeah.
I got those boxes, Manjula, I started to think, yeah, he has such rich material. He's writing to Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi is
Yeah.
responding. All of that kind of.
Yeah.
And so 20, COVID happened, and so like many of us, I moved to UK to pursue my second doctorate, and then simultaneously I started to kind of work.
Mm. So that's how it was the Berwa archive that kind of set you on this.
You may say that, yeah.
Yeah.
Primarily in a kind of preliminary stages of my thinking, yeah.
Mm. So, and then how did you take it forward? Because you've examined like caste in these settings, right? In the US, in UK, in Trinidad, in all these places where there are Indians, and but
Mm.
the way caste is experienced in these places is different. That's what's
Yeah,
interesting. That's what's really interesting about the book, how you examined how it is different in each of these locations. So let's start with the US, which is a really interesting chapter that it's very insightful. So, let's talk about that. Of course, because of the nature of immigration to the US and Trinidad, there are differences, and you've pointed that out. So let's start with that.
interesting. And thank you for kind of noticing that, because I think that's the story. So when I make a story, as you know, the titles of the book is not the author's choice always. There are
Hmm.
many factors that contribute to it. And I usually prefer like a very short title, not like and so I was kind of working on that, and so the global story picture that kind of came about, especially when the editors read and stuff like that, they say this is how it's going to be thought about. I say the book has already been conceived, and so what I wanted to say with caste's kind of a global dimension was to look at caste from the subjectivity of the victim,
Hmm.
and of its victim, right?
Hmm.
So Dalit as a subject kind of takes a central place in this text,
Hmm.
and and this Dalit subjectivity travels to nearly 14 plus one, 15 countries kind of with us,
Yes.
and these constituents are similar, but the kind of geographical, local, political that kind of interacts with it
Hmm.
gives a new dimension to caste. So though it is a kind of a global story, it is
Hmm.
also very particularly localized form of caste that we see operating in different parts of the world. Um,
Hmm.
and I'm glad that you kind of notice those kind of nuances that are there. So there is not like a blanket statement to say that caste, the way it operates in India, it operates in Trinidad, the way it operates in Trinidad, it operates in US or in UK. No, I mean, every situation is defined, and it's the country wisdom. You do certain things in certain region, those are peculiarities.
Yeah.
Right from how you imagine and manifest things. So in the US, for example, Manjula, I think the story of that is kind of uh, ancient. When I say ancient, I'm talking about American ancient, the
Mm,
history of America itself in the sense of modern colonial. So
mm,
we're talking about, 19th century. And there's been lots in Nico Slate kind of, did a banger piece. And then there's been all kind of solidarity. Daniel Immerwahr wrote about it, about this kind of historical connections, between the Indians who were there and then the caste angle kind of coming forth. And that story has been exploited and written about, rightfully so. Bhagat Singh Thind and all of those folks who wanted to be
yes.
like, we are of Aryan heritage.
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
and you can see how the local politics kind of, you know, makes sense for the people to gain more say in the constituency that they are applying,
Yes.
applying to be in. In this case, the caste story was a kind of phenomenon that we saw coming prominently with the ethos of anti-caste dimensions. So
Mm,
there is a caste story. There's always been, because this whole kind of Brahmin idea, Majumdar is a case, was like we are Brahmins, we are superiors, stuff like that in America. But
mm,
here, the way I looked at caste story was through the idea of embodied resistance. So the people who were kind of, not shying away from their identity, but also
mm,
utilizing that as a form of resistance. And because these were among the, people early kind of pioneers. So 1960s, when we see the immigration thing happening, people were coming from India. Dr. Berwa is one of them, and there are many, many other kind of, Dr. Singh, for example, who worked in Bell Labs, was an engineer, went to Johns Hopkins. So these were among the few countable people who had come along with this generation of
mm,
so-called early arrivals of post-Civil Rights Act immigration policy.
mm,
And when they went there, they didn't really assimilate in totality. They
mm,
were part of. And the interesting thing about it is, and this is what kind of is a very defining feature of anti-caste, Ambedkarite, by the way, activism,
mm, mm.
is that it's pan-India represented in diaspora. Meaning you can have a person from Andhra Pradesh, you can
Yeah.
have a person from Haryana, you can have a person from Punjab, or this in this case Rajasthan and so forth, and Maharashtra,
Mm,
and so this kind of continues. But the story of Ambedkar activism is also kind of preceded by doctoral students going to study in the 1950s, and
mm.
1960s, and so we see M.N. Wankhede, Dr. M.N. Wankhede, who
Yeah.
is one of the kind of a theoretician of this kind of Dalit black comparative analogies and literary
Mm.
kind of criticism. So studies Walt Whitman
Yes.
in Florida. First goes to Indiana and then Florida. He was meant to go to, I think, somewhere in the UK. Dr. Ambedkar's kind of patronage. Something happens, but he has to work, and then he goes. Then there is Dr. Nimgade, who again is inspired by Dr. Ambedkar in Delhi, goes to study agriculture, I think in Wisconsin, returns. And so somehow I also ended up having someone reached out to me from Wisconsin, a Punjabi heritage woman, third generation. Her grandfather had kind of come from Pakistan's part of, now
Mm.
Pakistan. Then
No,
uh,
Pakistan.
uh, they had got to Scotland for a brief stopover and then made a life in the US. And he had written his own kind of, kind of memoir, turn, into a genre of kind of autoethnography to say what happened. So
Mm.
there are many such stories there. We just were not focusing our attention too. So we see, that angle of caste is there. US is bubbling with this kind of a model minority, and there is this, but there is a group that is very desirous of forming a very plural India, constitutionalist values, and they looked at India not through this jaundiced perspective of only development, but they looked at through poor people's perspective. I mean,
Mm.
they could have also had this, get assimilated into this American dream, right? So
Yeah.
this American kind of example really proves, and Dr. Berwa becomes one of the first, or rather the first Dalit Ambedkarite person to go to the UN and speak against the atrocities committed in India. And he takes the Indian government and the Indian state by its wrist, which really It starts in 80s, and then Bhagwan Das and other kind of luminaries kind of join. So you see, this story is this kind of a story of educated people. Some people have PhD, and people are, the kind of a prefix is generally doctor among this, either
Mm.
physicians or doctorates.
Yeah.
And then in Trinidad, which is an older diaspora, which is kind of having a very interesting view of the world.
Yes.
And the world for them is looked through India, you know.
Mm.
And so this kind of the picture of India becoming, excuse me, kind of a static ancestral memory is
Mm.
still kind of a longing. And Trinidad is almost like um is almost poetic in the sense it's island, and you
Mm.
look and there is oceans, and the memory of oceans is strong. So it's not like you can escape that, and that
Mm.
diaspora is Hindu because that's what they associate themselves. And in many ways, the Indian state partook in presenting this viewpoint.
Mm.
The outposts of Indian state in different countries bolstered this form of identitarian viewpoint. That
Mm.
was not necessarily toxic, but
Mm.
it certainly emulated this kind of India as in Hindu and Muslim as in Pakistan, which is what also happened in many Northwest people, or people in this region who went to Bangladesh and so forth. And
Mm.
so their view is again kind of clustered by arrival of people from India who are members of the Hindu right organization. Vishwa Hindu
Mm.
Parishad has a presence. The RSS's offshoots are there. And so their view of India is kind of cultural view, but slowly, that gets commissioned into recruiting ground for the policies that we saw taking place in India
Mm.
2014 onwards.
Mm. But from what I get from your book, the diaspora in Trinidad is mostly working class, and originally they were like and it constantly reminded me of and you mention it as well. Naipaul's Million Mutinies now, where he mentions also
Yeah,
Brahmin by boat.
yeah,
And you've mentioned that, and all those really interesting aspects about the Trinidad Hindu community. So you want
hmm
to talk about that? Because I
yeah.
found it fascinating.
No, absolutely, and thank you for kind of teasing that out. Actually, it's very interesting. So now Trinidad, I talk, I say it as a Dalit republic, you know,
Yes.
because majority of people who had come and they had a caste register,
Mm.
and I went into the archives, National Archives of Trinidad and Tobago, and they are very well preserved, whatever kind of records, logbooks they could have, because it kind of coincided with. The census formation that was taking place in India, 1861 and
Mm.
71 and so forth, right? So the new
Mm.
research was coming. So inadvertently, the agents who were hiring folks for this kind of indenture work,
Endangered. Yeah.
they wanted a people who had already worked on farms,
Mm.
and it's no
Mm.
brainer.
Yeah.
You colonized a new kind of island, and you need a labor that you're already familiar with working, in India.
Mm.
And
Mm.
1860s was the time also when Queen's Proclamation came in, and it became official. India became an official kind of British colony.
Yes.
And so there was almost a seamless transition for this kind of labor to migrate. It was just that what kind of labor we want, and the labor
Mm.
they desired was Shudra and Ati Shudra, the Dalit, untouchable, or the Shudras, because most of the laborers were from the Dalit background, because these were kind of peasants. You know,
Mm.
these were
Mm.
not your farmers,
Mm.
and peasants are mostly either Dalits or kind of lower Shudras, uh,
Mm.
because the kind of caste formation that took place onwards from Mughal era was kind of concentrating in the hands of few kind of revenue giving classes,
Yes.
which turns into kind of solidified castes like
Mm.
Marathas or Reddys and Kammas and Kappus and Gaundars and so forth. So
Mm.
in this sense, in northern India, the equivalent was Kurmi, the equivalent was Ahir, and so forth castes. So when the register that was, when you went to a village, you know, you found people and you offered this 5-year contract, and it was a kind of almost generic across the island nations and oceanic migrations of Indian indenture that took place more than 120 years ago.
Mm.
And so if I have to recruit Manjula, uh, you know, there is an agent who's hired, and I'll say, Manjula, there is this job opportunity. What and Manjula is already catching hell, or Manjula is like, you know what, I need to do well for my family. Different reasons. There's no one
Mm.
reason, um, and so Manjula says, okay, in this case, Manjula cannot independently go because she is a woman. So she has to be accompanied. And so many times, what happens is, and this is not necessarily a Trinidadian story, this is an indenture story, which, uh, husband was dead, or, early marriages and so forth. They're talking about,
Yeah.
late or even kind of the crescent of the 19th century reaching, the 20th century. But most often time, they would ask a Suraj somewhere there, okay, Suraj, you would like to go? And yes, and so I had to get a kind of permission, kind of clarification, I mean, sort of verification, excuse me, from the local magistrate. So local magistrate by this time had kind of register, and this was, we are talking about United Provinces, this kind of UP,
Yes.
Bihar belt,
UPBR.
most
Mm.
often, right?
Mm.
And castes were already kind of dynamic in its formation. And then I will go to a coastal town, which is a big port, and which is the closest port for people in that region was Bengal. It
Yeah.
still is kind of an
Mm.
attraction. Then you went to Kolkata, then Calcutta, and there you were kept for this kind of health inspection. So you were tested if you're really, because you see, if you are investing, and this is again the London stock market kind of, profiting out of this. So they
Mm.
wanted to kind of make sure physically you were fit and somebody who we could trust on and who would perform the labor. So the medical report, the superintendent does the report and gives it, and then the final letter is before they embark about their ID. And the ID pieces, where they come from, their name, their last name, their caste, their height, this kind of anthropomic details that they provide. And then that log goes with the captain, and then the
Mm.
captain, is keeping track of it. And this journey is like 3 months, and people are kind of dying.
Yeah.
They are not used to seafaring across the oceans, and it's horrid journey. And so whoever survives, those log registers are then deposited, and so there, when you are received, you're also kind of marked. So we have that register. All say to say, the bureaucratic intensity of this indenture was very much programmed for
Mm.
the indenture system to regularize, because slavery was abolished and it was in
Yeah.
uniform system. So indenture came as a formality, and so this kind of provided. So it gave us this kind of register of caste, and we see majority of them. And this was research also done in 1960s by a guy called Baron Barton Schwartz,
Mm.
who along with colleagues published an edited volume, and they were also looking at Indian communities there, and they were looking at caste. And so there is a literature that there. Stephen Wertovic eventually did about Hindus. Tejaswini Niranjana has done research. Uh,
Gaitra
uh,
Bahadur has done about women. Huh?
Gayatri Bahadur has done in Guyana,
Yeah.
phenomenal,
Gaya.
looking at her, her own kind of lineage,
Yeah.
and of course beyond that, about the indenture experience of gender, and so especially the Caribbean coast, right? And so Trinidad is having a rich repository of community, but also scholarship that has been shaping
Mm.
for many years. There was Professor Ravinder Jain, and they were studying, all kinds of sociological, anthropological curiosity. There was also chutney music and so forth. So I
Mm.
was not really going into a new field. I was just following the trail left by these predecessors who
Mm.
had given much to kind of chew on. So I'd read this when I was studying for my first PhD in South Africa, and
Okay.
and and but South Africa kind of lost the sense of caste dynamism. So I thought, but here we see, there is some element, and I don't see caste even discussed the way it should have been. So that's why I kind of went. And more recently, Gajendran Ayadurai went to Guyana or Suriname, and he published a piece looking at caste, but he was looking mostly Tamilian communities, and that's
Mm.
kind of element that really enriches our understanding of, kind of immigration. And oftentimes we see this research that happens within the Tamilian discourse, it doesn't talk as prominently about caste, because then it gets into this kind of a sub-nationalist way of linguistic and kind of, Tamilian centric kind of scholarship, which is important, but really doesn't, it skews this much of this kind of debate about what I was trying to kind of understand. And
Mm.
so the Brahmin by boat becomes a metaphor where majority of these people, when they arrive, they they assimilate and change, they evolve, and they package themselves into a new soul, which then oftentimes becomes this idea of Brahmin by boat. Because and there is an interesting debate and conversation across the scholars there, who had happened to interview, and I wrote about them in the book. Kusha Harak Singh, my kind of coordinates, they were Arvind Singh. There was one Pandita, who was who was also very much kind of curious. There was Mr. Sam Maharaj, my host there. And so this kind of people were introducing me to this dynamics of Indian presence, and they looked at it not in a very aggressive tone, except the people who were in tune with Hindu nationalist agenda of India. And then they wanted to mimic that in Trinidad, and they were more robust and more vocal about it. But
Mm.
apart from them, and this happens also everywhere else, this kind of politically charged groups, and there is one which is just being there, right?
Mm.
And so the Brahmin by boat is a contested term. There's a scholar there, who recently died. He was making sense is how many Brahmins are there in India, and then he said, if that's the percentage, how can you assume that majority or sizable proportion is in Trinidad? Let's question that. And so he was, so that's the kind of nuance. And of course, Naipaul writes about it, but I think he could have done much better job of, when I was there, I read a book about him, a book by him, about his growing up in a neighborhood where this kind of a mongrel kind of surrounding that they were in this capital city. And I was trying to see how would you describe it, and it was very much uh, providing to a audience of that era, which was very much intensely invested in orientalized image. Not that
Mm.
Naipaul provided that with its absolute authority, but certainly that image without caste analysis. Then eventually his writing sort of, you know, got a view, but that too again an Indian perspective of caste, not a diasporic perspective of caste.
Mm. So did you also think of going to places like Fiji and Seychelles? I'm sure those places also have their specific I mean characteristics. You know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. In fact, the one of the first Ravidas Gurudwara. Now, Ravidas Gurudwara is a concept where the Chamars
Yes.
had kind of disassociated, because they were not given equal respect in the Sikh Gurudwaras, and though
Mm,
they
that
are
Vienna
Sikh.
incident, the Vienna incident kind of.
Correct, correct, correct.
Mm.
No, but this kind of Fiji Gurudwara, interestingly, is among the first. It is from the 1960s. Uh,
Oh.
exactly, and so there is a scholar called Brijlal who has not written about it exclusively, but a kind of authority in indenture literature, Indian indenture mostly, about Fiji. So these are the literature that I had read. Now, very interestingly, and Manjula, I think this is the cosmopolis of Indian caste experience,
Mm.
that majority of indenture settlements from India are about caste assertions, but the language just got less edgier and diluted, because the national identity kind of took a provenance, or the linguistic ethos kind of took a provenance. And the other subtleties were meant to be buried, because you went there to evade caste, so why would you reinvent caste? But
Yes.
the DNA of endangered societies worldwide has a strong register of caste DNA, and the lineage that looks at it is through the register of caste, but eventually it becomes, let's say, now Seychelles or the francophone regions within the Indian Ocean, right? Mauritius and
Yeah.
other groups, right? Uh, they they have a very strong element of their identity as some group of Indian, like mostly Tamilians or Biharis, or people who are from Hindi heartlands. There is
Yeah.
there, but also they are fighting against this kind of them being victims of their colonial masters, which is still very much present. French, they call it departments, right? In
Yeah.
this region. So you go
Yeah.
to Martinique, for example, all the way there, or Guadeloupe, and so we see always the narrative of the Africans, which it is, but there is also Indian, and there's mostly Dalit or lower
Mm.
Shudra kind of capacious presence of this kind of groups who are recognizing. And so these groups are there, and much research has to be done. So I ended up meeting one person who is a famous novelist that we all are aware of, Ari Gautier, whose father is Paraya, mother is Malagasy.
Mm.
And he kind of embraces this idea of Negro Dalitality, and he is Francophone, and so we see that kind of register of resistance through caste identity visible, but it doesn't inform itself as strongly, right? And so
Mm.
what we see, going back to the Fijian example, the Fijian Indians, rather Fijian Dalits, then migrate to the West. And where they end up? They end up in Ravidas Gurudwaras in California or in Canada,
Mm.
and I met them, and so they are as Indians or Punjabis as one could see, and
Mm.
they speak language and everything, but their ancestors are not from India directly; they are from Fiji. So we see this kind of uh, trans transnational. So I was calling them triple diasporas.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is what even Mamdani is to an extent, isn't he?
That's right. Yeah, he is a triple diaspora. Yeah, 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 for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, and so let's talk about the existence of caste. I mean, the recognition of the existence of caste in North America specifically. You know, which has been resisted for a long time, right? And like the recognition of it. And now it's
Mm-hmm.
being recognized that it exists. And that's a very recent thing. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, yeah. Thank
Also,
you.
the
I think
ties with which you've spoken about in the book, the inspiration from the black movements and all that.
yeah. Thank you for that question, Manjula. See, the Dalit, for example, presence marks a an arrival of this kind of anti-caste resistance. And so the American experiment really tells that there are various groups and lobby groups, and very interestingly, oftentimes the lobby group was not around civil rights, which happens to be a kind of a more recent phenomena than one would imagine. It was always associations of communities, and forming under the rubric of India or Hindu and so forth, kind of uh, uh, groupings. But with that came came another kind of angle to the story, which is
Mm.
that when the Dalits were kind of resisting casteism, they were not necessarily focused on America, because
Mm.
there they were not really concerned with the social groups there. Probably they were part of various kinds of Indian organizations, or probably they were not. Usually it happens, and it happens with people like me and many others. We go to these Indian groups and immediately feel excluded. Either they don't make attempt to include us, or they just promote a culture that is hostile to us, and so you just end up not becoming part of any of these groups, because it's not your culture. They are talking about all these fictions and stuff like that, and creating an image, and almost utilizing this constituency of many people for their own advantage. Also, you see the temple culture, and you see also associations of certain last names, and how they kind of interact and how they communicate with others. You already feel like this is not for me, because this is not really welcoming. It sounds vocally hostile, and in a very um, dogmatic way they represent that that we are of X caste, And then this certainly, I mean, a classic example is asking about your caste or last name, but also much of this is done through dog whistles for people to kind of realize, this is us and that's us, and then you get excluded. You're not invited. I was even at Harvard, and
Seriously?
yeah, yeah. I mean, you're like part of this Indian groups, and then you will realize, and um, you know, it's very it's I don't know what to do with this, Manjula. I think especially, and people probably don't mean harm, but they end up recreating this environment of uh, where and I've had this experience also with other Dalits, like especially Dalit women who would tell me, like we were sitting probably at a place surrounded by Indians, good friends, whatever, and then they would say, what, I didn't like that experience tonight, and they would say, and I would like, tell me more, and they would be like, the way the hostility they were saying, they were normalizing about, and this happened with a friend who was a Tamilian, Tamilian Malaysian who had come to America, uh, and she was from the Dalit background. She was a Buddhist, and then she got triggered, and I wanted to understand. Obviously, um, there was a kind of resistance in her because she had seen people like them kind of using certain words in Tamil which I don't really remember, but really kind of uh, told them that they are Brahmins, especially
Oh,
from certain kind of neighborhoods. And I thought she was being, sensitive to this. But then it turns out that these are the things. If I go in the Marathi circle, because it's caste is very much locally practiced. It's a vernacular,
yes, yes, yes,
and the way kind of the accent was also one of that.
yes. It is.
Especially this Chennai Tambram accent. And so with me also, like I had a Brahmin friend who works for a big media organization here. That's not his fault. That's just his accent. But that accent has been one of those oppressive tonalities that we have seen
Mm.
because you're not good enough. You can't speak in this posh kind of ways, and so we see this, and it's not just that. Like when you associate with this Indian groups and friends, which you think are friends, they end up triggering you because they want to deny your existence when you are trying to make a point, or undermine your kind of friendship in that by just delegitimizing your grievances or even your viewpoints or just mocking you down. I mean, it's just not
Mm.
sensitive. We won't see that at least among the new group of white and black groups, and this is what I've seen. The white groups
Mm.
go out of their way, and this I'm talking about
Yeah.
liberal, Harvard going, fairly good educated people would not kind of and you would see that also happening in the relationship of supervisor and students. Supervisors, if they happen to be Brahmins, and it's very interesting. I think this is how this culture and familiarity of caste happens even without us realizing in our households. Like we just
Mm.
normalize, and so I was, and it was so amazing. There was a student at Harvard, and her supervisor also was from one of the dominant caste, and both of them interacted as if they knew each other, and there was like a beautiful relationship. And I was looking at it from a perspective, could I step into that role and be the same with and there is somehow that caste barrier that will rear its head. You can call it cultural difference, you can call it uh, the education, the social capital, and those various cues that we have. But ultimately, it is about how we are, harmonized in our own caste, experiences. And so we see this happening in America, and so the example of caste becoming a US phenomenon is very much tied to this, where people, you know, don't realize and register, and then it uh, becomes a sort of people getting a kind of uh, distaste about that experience, and they want to disassociate, like
Mm.
you know uh, throughout the experiences, lock, stock, and barrel. They want to kind of get rid of that, and then you see how and so there is very little. Um what we kind of self-reflection, and caste really doesn't teach you to self-reflect somehow that.
Mm,
And I was talking to a friend who's a Brahmin, and he said, you know Indian Hindu society in a caste context doesn't allow you to even think beyond, because he says you can't exist in a Hindu society without caste. And I was asking him why. And then he kind of explained about his own upbringing, and how he when he went to a certain country, his friends happened to be from Brahmin community, and he then started to question that, like, how did that happen? And then he asked those same questions to friends of friends, and hey, do we realize that our friends happen to be, and so some people were like, they just happen to be our relatives, or just happen to be, and he's like, don't you see that as a problem? Because we say call ourselves Hindus, we call ourselves Indians, but majority of our circle is under the is surrounded by our own subcaste kind of groups, and that really gives us a very skewed perspective of what India stands for. And when somebody challenges us, we take it as an affront, and that's something that we've been telling. And for Dalits, for example, when they seek out similar groups, right?
mm,
Like, I'll tell you, when I went to UK, I wanted to start an Indian organization at my university.
mm, mm.
But my fellow Indians did not look at me as an Indian.
What? What?
They looked at me through my caste. And
No.
I was
Seriously?
I was so shocked, Manjula. And these are, by the way, I was like, and this is 2011, right? And I was too naive to register that. And it was like, I was like, but I'm thinking about starting an Indian organization. You all are my friends. And somehow my Facebook posts were about my assertion and stuff like that, and they didn't look at me as. And I was not really like complaining about anybody. I was thinking about them friends, cooking for them, we are eating and all. But somehow caste divorces that. So that idea then kind of became. So I can speak to it through my experiences about US or
Mm,
UK kind of caste dynamics. And so
mm.
that kind of sees itself manifested through activism in the book by various kind of legendary figures that we read about whom we read.
Okay. Okay, so I found it very interesting. Also the Sikh, not the Sikh bits, the Punjabi Buddhists in
Mm,
Wolverhampton, right?
mm,
I-
mm.
the that whole, I'd never heard of this before, and your book really opened my eyes to it, and I found it fascinating. It also reminded me of Santosh K. Singh's book on the Deras of Punjab, and he had mentioned in that about how the Deras, some of the Deras, have very extensive Ambedkarite libraries, you know. And then I made this connection and just talk about this group. It's like because you never hear of Punjabis being Buddhist. This is
And I
rare.
think this is really I appreciate you teasing out very important kind of vignettes from this book. I think this is also because even I was surprised. Hey, coming from Maharashtra and Nanded, what do I know? But then
Mm.
when I came here, I would associate Punjab with Sikh
Yeah,
religion, right? Um,
yeah,
there's no other way I am thinking of Punjab without a guy with a turban. And then I saw people, a very kind of charismatic group of handsome people here who were like, we are Buddhist. And I'm like, wait a minute. And that research took me down. And so these were folks who were inspired by Ambedkar. And Dr. Ambedkar had kind of given them whatever direction in politics, and historically Punjab has been Buddhist, and so they went on kind of researching about their own heritage, and they say Sikh is phenomenon for there, and also but they say what was before Sikh, and so you end up
yeah,
Harshvardhan and all this kind of Gandharas, and there's this
yeah,
Takshashilas, and
yeah,
um, majority sites of where Megasthenis and the cradle of so-called
yes,
Indian uh,
yeah,
kind of says, and so Buddhist is there, but
yes.
that's not their kind of interest. Their interest was primarily driven by Dr. Ambedkar, and these were people who were part of his Republican Party of India that Dr.
Hmm.
Ambedkar had given a blueprint, and so they were activists in India, many of them.
Hmm.
And
mm,
so when they left India for whatever reason in 1950s, some came in 1960s or 1970s. This kind of 3 decades of migration continued to happen with an active presence of conscious Ambedkarites, or at least Dalit uh, 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 kind of politics, but also intellectual churning that is happening in these spaces. And so in here, there are like Indian workers associations, there are Indian communist workers groups. So it's not like it's bereft of that. It is here, but
mm,
also they
mm,
experience caste there. So so the Jat groups, or generally that's the where you would associate with as a Punjabi, they would kind of crop up their caste supremacy that they had in here. Doesn't matter, you're a peasant and you're at the same level, but you would immediately, you would start sharing a room, but then once you are kind of well off, you would start making a difference about caste. So it's like convenience of caste supremacy. um,
mm.
and so then the Buddhist groups were like with these people who were inspired and had come from that education. But then a few people played an important role in that, and kind of I mentioned to them. But also these are like Lahori Ram Bali, who was the secretary of Scheduled Caste Federation of Punjab, founder of Bhim Patrika, about whom I wrote for
Mm,
Hindustan Times, and we organized a kind of lecture in his honor. The other was Bhagwan Das, a person
mm,
who was from Balmiki community, who became Buddhist, who served with Dr. Ambedkar in 1955-50s. Incidentally, yesterday was his death anniversary, just to
mm,
mention. And he was, from Shimla, and continued that streak of politics. They would often visit uh, UK, and also the literature kind of was available for them. So some of these people who were kind of partly educated or literate at least would read these books, and it's like, okay, that's our lineage, and we should kind of work on it. Then local leaders like Chanan Chahal, we have enormous kind of galaxy of leadership that kind of laid foundation. Many of them are now late. I just happened to go to one, Mr. Ratu, who passed away as a Buddhist, became a monk. It's kind of interesting. You see that these people born as a Chamar became Buddhist, married their children Buddhist. The children kind of continued, but the grandchildren sort of lost that streak of thought. And so you see
mm.
how that kind of, this graph goes ups and down, kind of slides down and upwards. But there was a strong assertion about Punjabi Buddhists. So they established a society, Punjab Buddhist Society, in the UK. Um, and they were very much driven by political purpose. This was among the what you would call rational group when it came to dialogues and interactions with communities, and they focused. So they formed Wolverhampton Buddha Vihara, among the first, I think, probably the first Buddhist Vihara outside India, formed by Ambedkarite Buddhists. And so they had a Thai monk who became their patron monk for many years, and they even named the Vihara after him, the
Mm,
shrine room after him. What something something Pra, and you're like, where are we?
mm.
And then there is a big statue of Dr. Ambedkar, and in this statue, this kind of a life size, he is not showing the finger.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
So,
That's
it's
unusual.
this is unusual, and so they are like, we want him to come. He's inviting us to come to be part. So this kind of interesting innovation that takes among people. And let me tell you, Manjula, this community is a very strong resource of intellectual originality that have, like, scholars, like, every time the community is extraordinary. I mean, they surpass the amount of intelligence that one would expect from a community. Otherwise we would think, as a scholar, as an intellectual, oh, you know the best. But let me tell
Mm,
you, the community, especially the Ambedkarite community that I've been researching, is an is extremely sharp, incisive, innovative. They are very dashing in their perspectives, and I'm like, wait a minute. Now you just change an Ambedkarite perspective, or Ambedkar statue here rather, to say Ambedkar is calling you to come inside. I'm like, how beautiful is that, So that's how it kind of takes place, and that's the kind of activism that kind of shapes over the years. And now we see that second to third generation kind of losing that, but the new arrivals embracing their again Buddhist identity.
okay, okay. And what I also found really interesting was how, how I mean, it's been spoken about, but or you brought it forth again. How the black struggles in the U.S. have benefited Indians going there, and in a way, I mean, if you're like upper caste, you're already so privileged, but you're
Hmm.
going there and you're kind of like taking over their, it's a bit of a hijack, right? So talk about that.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So the primary kind of motivation for post 1960s is happens due to Civil Rights Act. It
Yes.
opens up, it gives the Civil Rights Act is not just like voting rights and kind of affirmative actions and liberties for black people, but it's a whole lot. It's a set of Civil Rights Acts.
Hmm.
It's and so one of that was to kind of have more kind of labor because also industrial market post-war America needed it, so Indians
Hmm.
kind of filled in, and much of them who were invited to go. By the way, America was not a preferred destination for many
Yes.
because a it was too far,
Hmm.
and you were more familiar with UK, uh,
Yes.
or you went to Canada, but not America,
Hmm.
in the sense that I'm talking about this era of migrants who were educated post-colonial, post-independence, and so when they went there, it was really like you can't say that they went there to think about, okay, I'll settle here. Uh, you know, Many went there, unlike in UK, you went there to sort of find because you had this kind of um long connection with migration of colonial connections,
Yes.
which was absent in America. So many went there, experimented, found an organization. And I think it was very much kind of, if you will, at least I've not come across. It was harmonious. It was not like deranged, so to
Hmm.
speak. Um, but eventually, uh, it was primarily driven by this capitalist success. And
Yes.
so Indians model itself and across the groups who were dominant caste with this idea of American meritocracy, well knowing that they are beneficiaries of affirmative action and like policies. So it
Yes.
was very ironical for them because they thought they got job because they had degrees. They thought, uh, and they somehow looked at themselves as superior people. And this is coming from Gandhi's example. Also in South Africa, we are not lower. We are like Aryans and we are equivalent to you and stuff. And this also happens in Trinidad. They look at themselves as, we are oldest civilization, we are Vedic, and this is because again this colonial policy of pitting black and Africans and Indians, and you
Hmm.
are
Hmm.
Africans, you're and English, you are not even, you are Europeans, barbaric people, we had civilization and stuff like that. So that kind of streak of nationalism kind of takes place, but it's very much enclosed. It's not kind of open.
Hmm.
And so it's not really unified. For example, the Mallu or the Tamilian is not really interacting with a person from North. I mean, there's no
Hmm.
relation,
Yeah.
the whole culture is different. And so this pan India thing doesn't really even now exist. It's
Yeah.
very much like you have like your uh, Telangana Association or
Yeah.
Andhra groups, and most of these are associated around caste. For example, there was also this kind of caste aligned different groups of different regions,
Hmm.
and this is
Hmm.
and so with the black kind of intervention, what happens is the Dalit groups sort of find an alignment with them, and that kind of very much interactively becomes, and I asked many scholars like activists. One is Mr. Yogesh Varade, who was in Germany, then went to Canada, has founded Ambedkar Center for Justice and Peace, was a
Hmm.
UN lobby. It's the first Ambedkarite UN lobby group for Dalits.
Hmm.
um, and so what I asked Mr. Varade, why wouldn't you seek out Black Panthers, for example, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you have Dalit Panthers here, and so you could as well. And he was from Maharashtra, so you may very well. And he's like, yeah, he was aware of, but he's like, the Black Panther group was already put under scanner in FBI,
Hmm.
by FBI, and we did not want it to also kind of ruffle those feathers because
Hmm.
it was well known among activist circle that FBI is infiltrated, and so they say. So he said, and I was kind of pushing him to kind of uh, respond to this question about this lack of solidarity, and he's like, it was not the case. It was just that since they were already in pressure and they were working for a cause which is also a minority and oppressed, they couldn't really kind of risk that because they were trying
Mm.
to find their kind of solid grounding. And they were also, they were still immigrants, right? And they could turn
Yeah.
hostile, and they were fighting against the Indian state primarily for the in the cause of justice. But eventually, Dr. Berwa kind of, one of his patients happens to be a guy named Peter Green, who is a radio host. And this is the golden era of radio, right? Like
Mm.
everybody, you're on radio, you are like, star. So he then, discusses with him, and he's like, why don't you? He introduces him to a few people, and the first Ambedkar Jayanti at any institution that happens in America happens at the historically black university, which
Yeah.
is Howard University.
Mm.
And so I interviewed the student activist around that time, and we had a long chat, and he talked about what it meant and how he got instituted into this idea of, and so they started this kind of Ambedkar celebration with Dr. Ambedkar and Martin Luther King, and there was this kind of third world solidarity happening. So this activism really shapes. It's very much part of that era. It is
Mm.
very much a piece of that history that is shaping them. And so the Dalit activism also kind of informs itself through this politics of associating, but it doesn't really take a concrete shape until very recently. But then we see our friends from Andhra Pradesh or Tamil Nadu, the Dalits, who were already in tune with the Christian liberation theology,
Mm.
we're
Mm.
interacting
Mm.
piecemeal with black churches and so forth. Uh,
Mm.
and I think that kind of archive, because they were not really vocal about their kind of position as much as this Ambedkarite Dalits would be, that
Mm.
kind of story remains sort of yet to be explored. But certainly there is also that kind of register where we see, I would suspect there would be some kind of, some valuable insights that one could gain from that. But anyway, this kind of black and all connection happens recently, and then because I am part of that history, I go to America in 2015. Uh, Prior to that, there has been involvement and interaction with people like Dr. KP Singh, who was a dean at Gautam Buddha University in Lucknow, now a business person in Dubai. He was a professor at University of Washington in Seattle. He started to sort of engage, but it was primarily still Asian studies, South Asian studies, right? Because in
Mm.
America, it's like you are zoned into region. Oh, you're a South Asian scholar, you're an African studies scholar, you're a Chinese studies scholar. But it really started to, they then start, in late 2010s is when we see, um, uh, not late 2010s. I think it's the arts of 2000s when it starts to interact with people like Cornel West and black kind of solidarity shaping. And by the time I went there, there was a familiarity already. And so
Okay.
then I sort of got involved in developing this because as I write in my book in the introduction, this is very much a story that was kind of harnessed in Nanded by my father, by
Mm.
the Dalit Panthers and their connections. And so for me, it was just normal. That's why I went to South Africa as well,
Mm.
studying in Africa among the black people, trying to kind of create solidarity and cement the struggle. And then the rest we see history with my kind of work with black activists, scholars, artists, and so forth. And that history is continuing.
Mm. Now, you also mentioned that you're going to, that in the future, perhaps you'll study caste in other societies,
Yeah.
right? I found that really fascinating. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, yeah, sure. So, what I want to do is, I mean, I've already started doing it. So I wrote a paper called Global Caste uh, for a very good journal that kind of looks at these issues very critically, ethnic
Mm.
and racial studies. And I there's already research on caste, and so I went to South Africa to do that, to study caste among different, and it was meant to be a legal analysis bordering anthropology. But my supervisor then, who never became my supervisor, he discouraged me from doing that. And he was a Marxist Brahmin, uh, you know
Yeah.
uh, uh, you know uh, and so many things. Uh, so what we see in this position is that the caste angles that we are referencing, I'm referencing to, is very much a colonial idea of caste.
Mm.
And societies are shaped with the governmentality that's operating at that time. Like for now, the way caste has been bureaucratized, for example, or identity of any group, or
Mm.
your social policies are products of their time, and state plays an
Mm.
important role. So similarly, in this colonial expansion and experience, we see this happening. We see this kind of diverse groups that are existing. Um,
Mm.
in Africa, in Latin America, and so forth, and they were using the kind of almost same language. So in my at my Oxford thesis, I I have a section on it about looking at caste in different societies, and so they may be called differently: racial caste, color caste, um, tribal caste, in our case Brahminical caste, and so forth. But caste as a placeholder to analyze a society that is organized on the principles of hierarchy, purity,
Mm.
pollution,
Mm.
endogamy, reproduction of culture through this kind of uh, 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 monopolizing of resources by certain group of people based
Mm.
on the identity. And so if you look at an African, we can't look at African just as an African or a black person. There are so
Yeah.
many identities,
Yeah.
that they subscribe to. Similarly with Indian and any other society, it's very rare that mm, we'll find a, so to say, common society of the commoners. It's usually
Yeah.
defined by the kind of
Yeah.
top-down kind of perspective, and so that's the something that and I want to do a kind of once I take up this kind of once I go once the book kind of takes its own life, then I want to kind of but I've already started writing about it. It will need for me to at least go to three more countries that I really want to go: Nigeria, Senegal, and Brazil, and to really conduct more research. But recently I was told that the Central Asian countries also have some form of this kind of Eurasian streak that
Okay.
we talk about in India. So I have to uh, and it's very difficult, Manjula, to do this. You know why? Because we are so animated and fascinated by the colonial, capital C, program or agenda, that we are not really, like I've been talking to people, and can we, I mean, I want to look at societies through pre-colonial, but not this kind of nationalistic sense.
Mm.
It's like
Mm.
pre-colonial India. What was it? Oh, it was so
Yeah.
great land and stuff. So you know what I mean. So I wanna be sensitive to that kind of story, and so it will take some time, but that's something I will very confidently do in near future.
Okay. Okay. I could keep talking to you because I still have lots of questions, but we should wrap it up now. So, for the listeners, go out and get Caste, a Global Story by Suraj Milind Yengde. It's an excellent book, and it throws yes, yes, both covers, yours and
That's great. That's great.
the
Oh,
Indian
so
cover
sweet.
and the international one.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I have to say it's a really insightful read, and thank you for talking to me about the book.
You are the first one I enjoyed talking to. After all, you are my editor, Sahiba, and I'll continue
I
to honor this. But I'm really want to say that it's been amazing also working with you, Manjula, because I write long reviews and they get published in Hindustan Times because I'm a book reviewer there, yo. So I'm happy to speaking to an organization that I have a relationship with.
okay. Thank you. See
Thank
you
you.
then. Bye.
Bye, Manjula.